that you know, he doesn't come around much. That part of me isn't here anymore.
I'm a paranormal investigator, based in the southwest of the UK. Me and the team went to investigate one of the UK's most haunted cemeteries, Charlfield, to see if it lived up to the hype, and I went from being a skeptic to a believer. It started out very quiet, with little to no activity happening, but as the night went on, we began to hear footsteps following us throughout the graveyard. Our walkie-talkies would make a static noise on command as a response to any questions, and whatever was there would make the light on the walkie-talkie activate when asked to. Towards the end of the investigation, we started to get a deep voice come through on our spirit box, and I started to feel really lightheaded and faint, so I passed my camera and equipment to my friend, and a split second later, I woke up outside the cemetery grounds on my own. Completely lost time. I made my way back to the cemetery, and my two fellow investigators explained that I had been acting strange for a good 40 minutes and walking around the cemetery with no torch. It was early hours of the morning with no ambient light or street lights, so it was pitch black, and navigation was impossible without a torch. As you can imagine, I was a little bit shaken by this and had no memory of the event, and as I edit all our videos, I got to see exactly what happened to me, which was terrifying. Something possessed me that night, and if you watch the footage of our investigation, you can see my eyes are just pure evil during this time. That night I got home to go to sleep, and I could see a dark shadow in my room of a tall creature just moving and hovering over me. The fear was indescribable. Scratching noises and banging on my walls persisted for a good 2 weeks before stopping and never coming back. This was the third episode of our very first season. I made sure to put some protection in place for all future investigations, but this is the most terrifying event that ever happened. Thanks for listening. Just to preface, I think it's reasonable to try and medically explain my own personal experience. I'm going to explain things as they happen, and include a few bits of hearsay from others. So, I was a Navy corpsman, stationed in Okinawa for almost 3 years, an island south of Japan. Famously, it was the site of one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. Right now, it's what we call the tip of the spear, having 6 Marine bases and an Air Force base. It's basically the launching point for any shit that starts off concerning China and North or South Korea. I'll also state that I do have an interest in the paranormal or supernatural, so maybe that interest paints the memory in a biased light. This was sometime in 2015. My whole time there, I would rotate between the emergency department and the fire station where I functioned as a paramedic. It was just me, a tiny little Japanese ambulance, and a bunch of Okinawan firefighters. This particular incident happened at Camp Hansen, the second furthest base from the Naval Hospital. One night, around 2 a.m. on a weekend, we get dispatched to one of the barracks buildings. I think the report was head injury. Anyways, I arrive in the stairwell to find a young Marine on his back, being restrained by 10 people. Multiple people per limb, and at least one holding down his head. This guy's head was covered in contusions that were already nice goose eggs. His eyes were rolled back. All I could see were the whites of them. He was pushing his chest up, about as hard as he could. And when he wasn't biting the air and gnashing his teeth like some sort of wild animal, he was screaming, "Make it stop," over and over again. They had his head forced down because he kept trying to smash the back of it against the ground. While we do our best to get him on a spine board and restrain him on it, I get the story from the witnesses. The guy had just been drinking a beer, talking to the Marine standing watch at the quarterdeck. According to the guy he'd been talking to, he seemed normal, like his usual self. Then according to the witnesses, he suddenly and out of nowhere walked over to the stairwell next to them and began screaming and slamming his face and head against the stairs, which is where all those contusions came from. They made it sound like it was a very abrupt change. For me, I'm in work mode. It's definitely strange, but I didn't get any, weird vibes. Just sort of processing it all as bizarre while thinking in the back of my head, didn't someone else mention they responded to a similar call just a few months ago? Someone told me they responded to that exact barracks building for a guy that was acting possessed. Similar story. Guy turns on the drop of a hat and becomes violent, and they have to tie him up with paracord while he's screaming, "Get it out." I later asked my firefighters, most of whom don't speak a lot of English, and they made it sound as if this happened a lot at that barracks. Anyway, I have the guy in my ambulance. He's fully strapped down, handcuffed to the spine board, and I have the staff sergeant there who says he was the guy's NCO from their last duty station. He described him as a pretty straight arrow. No history of trouble with drugs or substance abuse. Now, trying to rationalize it, there were drug problems with Marines on the island. Mainly Tylenol with codeine you could get over the counter at Japanese stores we weren't technically allowed to be in. And spice. Lots of spice issues. It's a synthetic cannabis that was also over the counter. It's typically laced with all different sorts of shit to get around bans. One ingredient in a brand is banned, so they mix up the formula and put it back on the shelves. I'd responded to a spice-linked call once. Some sweaty and spaced out guy in a post office. This didn't seem like that, but what the hell do I know? Anyway, the only way I can get this guy to sort of calm down is, and I don't know why I thought of this, but I just sort of moved the big plastic strap of the blocks securing his head over his eyes so he couldn't see. Kinda like how you see them do with alligators. I figured less stimulation is best. It works, sort of. He just kind of grunts and makes the occasional noise by the time we get him to the ER. Or maybe he's just tired himself out. Anyway, we get there, and it's Holdall City for him. He's sedated and the ER does its thing. I don't know what ultimately happened to him, but I do remember that one of the diagnoses ended up being rhabdomyolysis. Basically, muscle tissue breaks down and releases myoglobin into the blood. It can cause kidney damage, and when your kidneys shut down, you can become confused. If I wanted to explain it that way, I could, but to my knowledge, that's just not how it works. Infection and organ failure related confusion just doesn't happen that quickly. Not in the way the witnesses described. Could he have had some underlying psych issue? A mental break? Maybe. Schizophrenia? Perhaps. But it doesn't explain the apparent trend of incidents for that building. None of the other barracks had that kind of history to my knowledge. By the time I'd handed off the guy to the ER, I felt a little weirded out. But I was actively thinking of the other story I'd heard. I'm talking to the ER physician, and I sort of made a comment about not thinking it was drug-related. And he basically just gives me a look and says, "You're an idiot. Go back to the station and get some sleep." So, I just kind of forget about it. I did not follow up on what happened to him, although I easily could have. I'll end this by saying, there's at least one other bit of paranormal type stuff I was aware of. The barracks building next to the one I was in apparently had a problem with sleep paralysis. It was building 5704 if anyone's familiar with Foster. I'd hang out with Marines at the smoke pit, and quite a number of them reported that they experienced sleep paralysis. And one of them mentioned seeing dead Japanese girls in his room when it happened. Fun stuff. Anyway, that's the story. I tried to be blunt about it. Sorry if it's not as descriptive as it could be. Like I said, I was kind of in work mode. Okay, this is a story my mum hates to tell because it scares her that much. I already forgot a lot because it's been a long time since the last time she told me the story. She always says she does not want to speak about it. I don't believe in the supernatural, but my mum seriously gets scared every time she tells this. So I find it hard to not believe her. I already have goosebumps writing this. There was a man in our village that apparently got possessed by his own dead father. And one night, he went out drinking. At around 3 a.m, he went home, and on his way home, he started to break every window he saw. He also walked through the cemetery. Anyways, when he got to my grandmother's house and started to do the same, break windows, my grandmother, uncle and his wife, and my mum came out. They knew him and thought he was drunk, so they started to talk to him. His hands were bloody because of the broken glass, and his voice was growly and low. They tried to calm him down, but he wasn't having it. Once my mum got closer to speak to him, he told her to back off with his normal voice. He said that because she was pregnant with me at the time, and somehow my mum being pregnant was able to bring him out. I don't know. My mum fainted because she got weak out of nowhere after he told her to back off with his normal voice. His voice got growly and deep again afterwards. Then, when my mum woke up, she saw him literally crawling up a palm tree my grandmother had in their garden. She said he was crawling the tall tree extremely fast and looked like an animal crawling on his fours instead of using mostly his arms like normal humans do when climbing. I don't remember what happened next, but when the sun rose, he started to speak normally again, and apparently all his wounds from the broken windows were healed, and he had not even a scar. Also, he could not remember anything. He then went to a priest who told him he had to do certain things to get rid of his father's spirit. If I remember correctly, he had to walk through the cemetery for a couple of days at an exact hour. When I was 15, my mum got really sick. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling or sleeping. She would eat like a toddler, picking at things with her fork. We didn't know what was wrong with her, but eventually, since she would barely eat and was becoming more of a recluse, my dad took her to the ER. She came home and went to a specialist the next day. My dad picked us up early that day and took us home, not sharing what happened until we got home. My mum had stage 3 terminal cancer in multiple areas of her body. She had been completely fine 3 months before. We went on with our lives as we all worked through this with my mum. Our pastor told us he had friends who ran a Pentecostal church a couple of hours away, and that maybe he could help us as he had tried everything he could. We decided to make the drive since we didn't have anything else to lose. This preacher knew we had arrived, despite not knowing what we looked like, our names, nor when we were coming. So shortly after we sat down together in a pew, he asked my mum to step forward. We all stood and followed her up to the front of this church, with 200 people staring at us. My sister and I were taken to one side of the altar by 2 older women, and my mum, dad, preacher, and 9 or 10 other people were opposite us. They started talking to my mum, and up until now I have no idea why we were here. The 2 women were talking with us, their arms around our shoulders. I heard over their voices growling, screaming, and profanities being spewed into the air by someone. It sounded like my mum's voice, but like she was using something to distort her voice. I looked at my mum for a moment, only to realize I wasn't looking at my mum. Yes, same hair, clothes, height and weight. It was my mum, but something had taken her over. I could see it. Her face was distorted as if something was trying to escape her. Her eyes, very, very dark, despite being bright blue any other time. Her smile was large and unnatural for her. In that moment, I realized it was my mum making all those terrible sounds. Finally, it seemed the darkness that had overtaken our lives was gone. My mum was sitting near the altar. I walked over, hugged her and sat down next to her. We talked for a few minutes, my dad and my sister coming to join us. People were leaving, and as we were getting our things together, the preacher and his family came to invite us to dinner. That night, my mum ate a large pizza, salad and an order of 8 wings and breadsticks, all on her own. It was the most she had eaten in a year. The next day, Monday, my mum went to be seen to check the progression of her cancer. That day, she found out every single speck of cancer was no longer plaguing her body. She was as healthy as she was before this started. We haven't had an issue since then, and I'm 27 now. The demon who made himself known as Seth tortured my mum for years before this incident, coming in and out of her life. Hopefully, he's gone for good. A bit about me. I'm 20 going on 21 and I'm a first generation medium. When I was a kid about 9-10 years old, I lived in an old 2-story house with the paint chipping on the outside, and the backyard was a 10-acre bamboo forest that was dense. One night, I woke up a little after midnight, having to use the restroom, and when I went to go open my bedroom door, I noticed it wouldn't budge. I checked to see if it was locked. It wasn't. So my next guess was that my brother, who was a few years older than me, was on the other side of the door holding it closed. So I banged on the wall between his and my room, and he yelled at me to go back to sleep from his room. Immediately after I heard him, I started pounding on my door, trying to get some help, and after a few minutes, my mother woke up and tried to open the door, but she couldn't get it to move either. She even went as far as unscrewing the doorknob, but still, it didn't work. I guess I passed out sometime, cause I don't remember what happened after that. A few nights later, I woke up between 2 to 3 a.m, needing to use the restroom, and I was in there for a few minutes, so I had some time to wake up, and when I got back to my room, I instantly felt something was watching me. I slowly looked towards my window, because out of the corner of my eye, I could see that it was opened. When I moved in my room a little bit and was able to fully look out the window, I froze. My room is on the 2nd floor with nothing under the window for 25 feet. Yet, something was staring me dead in the eyes. I couldn't move. After a few seconds, I was able to dive behind my bed to try and avoid it. I've never seen anything like it. It had a rotting, bloody face with glowing yellow eyes and a dark grin. Again, I passed out. The next couple of nights after I saw it, I wasn't able to sleep in my room out of fear, so I slept downstairs on the futon. That was a mistake. The 3rd night I slept on the futon, I woke up outside, deep in the middle of that bamboo forest, covered in dirt and leaves. After, I got up and tried my best to get back to my house, but when I got back, the cops were there because I was reported missing. I somehow got out of the house without unlocking any of the doors or windows, and without setting off the alarm. A few months after that, we moved out of that house, and I started seeing things that I couldn't before. I know it's still following me, or rather, something is. Ever since the original incident, I've been getting more involved into the paranormal and metaphysical, and I've come to realize many things, but many things are still left unanswered. The one thing I did learn is the identity of the demon, and a little bit about why it was after me. The reason why it was after me, I've had this confirmed by a few psychics, but I apparently have a dark spot in my soul that was placed there when I was about 9-10, which aligns with the original incident. But ever since that happened, I've been able to see things and sense things that other people couldn't see, and I could do things as well. But recently, after about a year of having a ward placed in my house to keep everything out, I took it down just to see if anything would happen again. And right as rain, something happened the next night, and the night after that. A few days ago, I started feeling like my body wasn't completely my own. Like as if I was watching from the sidelines. I could see my life playing out. It almost feels like something else has made a home out of my body. Any advice or help is appreciated. I have relatives in Malaysia, and I recently went for a funeral there. This story was told to me by a relative when he saw the same priest that was performing the rites for my dead relative. He said this same priest performed rites for another guy in Kedah, in Malaysia, and something epic happened, which even this priest told them that it was the first time he witnessed such things. By the way, my relative was at both funerals. Just some background. Funerals in Malaysia usually last 1 night or 2 nights, and the rites are long. It is not uncommon to stretch until 2 or 3 a.m. So, for this other funeral, the priest and relatives were calling back the spirit at about 11 p.m. The streets were quiet and there was no wind. They tried a few times, but to no avail. After more than a few times, suddenly the dogs on the streets whined and barked, and the winds suddenly blew strongly. Exactly at this moment, one of the relatives, a young guy in his early 20s, suddenly jumped up. They were all kneeling down, and shouted, "She's back." He knocked into all the others who were kneeling down. He then ran into a room in the house and was apparently shaken. The rest ran into the room to check on him, and suddenly this guy was possessed and spoke in a strange tongue. 4 to 5 strong men tried to subdue him but couldn't. The priest then realized that this guy was wearing a Buddha pendant or amulet on his neck, the type where there's a Buddha in the box, and he pulled it out immediately. The guy then collapsed and fainted, but woke up shortly after. Just when everyone thought it was over, and the priest was explaining that this guy committed a sin by wearing Buddha pendant and kneeling down in front of the deceased. Buddha is a god and shouldn't kneel down to people. That's why he was possessed. This part I'm not sure, so I want to hear what you guys say. Back to the story. When the priest was explaining halfway and everyone was taking a rest, suddenly the mum of the guy who was possessed went to the coffin and shouted loudly at the corpse. She shouted, "You are dead, and you shouldn't come back to harm the living." The priest rushed outside the house to the coffin to where the auntie was, and immediately used his gear to contain the situation. The rites that we see on TV the priests usually do. This auntie then calmed down and fainted. After all these happened, everyone was scared, and nobody really dared to do anything. The priest then explained what was going on. He also asked if this family were praying to a master of sorts, because this auntie was possessed by a master, and the relatives said yes. Note that this family weren't from this Malaysia state, and this was the first time they met the priest. The priest wrapped up the rites and got everyone to sit down and explained what happened. He said for the first case, the young guy, he shouldn't wear a Buddha pendant and kneel in front of the deceased. and reminded everyone, next time don't do the same thing. As for the second case, the auntie was too overwhelmed with emotions when she saw her son being possessed, and this invoked the master to possess her. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.